Star Wars as a franchise has had a lot of ups and downs, and ups, and then downs, and then a lot more downs. But as a whole, it's a franchise that sort of refuses to die. Throughout the franchise's long run, it's pumped out a lot of games. Some of these games get so good that they transcend the franchise as a whole and outright become genre-defining staples. Empire at War is not one of these genre-defining games. But honestly, I think it should have been. Given that it's a whole franchise revolving around wars in space, one would expect that the Star Wars franchise would dominate the strategy game genre. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Compared to the steady stream of excellent action and adventure games coming out of the franchise, Star Wars strategy games have consistently been somewhat disappointing. I mean, sure, Star Wars Battlegrounds was alright, but it's an Age of Empires reskin. Like, it's even made by the same devs running on the same engine, hardly the pinnacle of strategy games. So, when Petroglyph Games announced that they were working on a new Star Wars strategy game for LucasArts, fans were expecting great things, especially when you consider who Petroglyph was made up of. This studio was founded by people from the then recently closed down Westwood Studio, which was, mind you, the team behind the original Command & Conquer games. Yes, that Command & Conquer. The legendary franchise that defined the RTS genre for years since it released. That's the kind of gravitas that Petroglyph's roster carried, and by God did they not disappoint. Star Wars Empire at War was released in February 2006 to generally positive reviews, and it was a beast of its own. Even today, it's hard to point to another game that's like it. The game's success got itself an expansion pack which came out on October of that same year. The Forces of Corruption expansion pack introduces an original new faction in the form of the Zan Consortium, as well as a new scripted campaign. All in all, Empire at War is a well-liked game that still consistently draws in thousands of players each month on Steam. In fact, there's even an argument to be made that the player count is somewhat on an upward trend. But how could this be? How is an RTS game from 2006 somehow still capturing the attention of thousands of players every month? Well, I'm so glad that you asked. Let's get right into breaking this game down. First things first, what's going to strike any new player booting up Empire at War for the first time is its visuals. The models are a bit dated, as one could expect from a game from 2006. That being said, the main menu being a close-up of spaceships doing spaceship things might actually give a misleading first impression. Remember, this is an RTS game. 90% of your experience isn't going to look like this, but instead like this. You're mostly going to be way up looking down, pointing and clicking. In that sense, the graphical fidelity of the game is at a perfectly fine and functional level. It's not the prettiest thing ever, but it works, and it actually works pretty well. Each unit has a fairly unique silhouette which helps you easily identify it. Even for the Imperial ships, it's not hard to tell a Victory Star Destroyer from an Imperial type. Yes, it's actually pretty easy to figure out which type of flying cheese wedge of death is which, despite their similar designs. If the unit is a bit too small for you to recognize by silhouette, there's a big handy glowing unit icon that tells you what's what. Those swarms of TIE fighters or X-Wings might get a little slippery to click on, but at the very least it's easy enough to tell where they are and what they're doing. Same applies to the ground units. You know how to tell the difference between the regular Rebel troopers and the Rebel troopers carrying hyper bazookas. So all in all, the visual clarity of what's going on screen is actually pretty good. It's a spectacle with lots of effects, but it hardly, if ever, gets overwhelming. It's fairly easy to keep track of what's going on, though sometimes I do wish we could zoom out just a little bit more. With how hectic the battles can get, it'd be nice if I could get a much larger overview of the battlefield to help me manage my units. I mean, there is the super zoom out camera mode, but the game disables the HUD when you activate it. Getting good at the game mitigates this issue somewhat, but it would be nice to have more zoom out options. On the audio side of things, the game recreates not only the music but also the sound effects of the Star Wars movies really, really well. This shouldn't be a surprise when they not only had assistance from LucasArts Direct, but also had Frank fucking Klepacki himself as audio director. Yes, that same Frank Klepacki, the legend who composed some of the most iconic songs from the original Westwood Command & Conquer games. Klepacki is a massive Star Wars nerd and did his absolute damnedest to create the perfect Star Wars soundscape for the game. Klepacki was also instrumental in pushing the game to run on a surround sound system, which was kind of a novel thing back then. He also personally directed the original soundtrack for the expansion pack, and LucasArts at the time accepted his work without revision, which, if nothing else, really speaks to the quality of his work. This all culminates to create one of the best sounding Star Wars games to come out in the mid-2000s, and it's still something that you can appreciate today. However, seeing and hearing isn't all there is to a video game. We're talking about games after all, and gameplay is king in this matter. There's a bunch of layers in how Empire at War's gameplay works. There's the battle layer, which comes in both the space and ground variety, and then there's the grand strategy layer. Let's start at the bottom of the gravity well, and then work ourselves up. So with the ground battles, it's absolutely basic RTS stuff. If you've played an RTS game before, you know most of what's going on. Click and drag to select, right click to give orders, move, attack, what have you, and click the ability button to activate special abilities. Units are strong against certain units and weak against others. Empire at War does this very helpful thing by telling you each unit's characteristics, strengths, weaknesses, and abilities when you hover your mouse over them. This lets you more easily plan what kind of army composition you want to build. There's not a lot of overly complicated systems here, and most mechanics are fairly straightforward. You don't have to manage unit positioning the same way you do in a game like Company of Heroes. Your tank doesn't take extra damage because the enemy is hitting it from the back. It takes extra damage because a unit that it's weak to is hitting it. Some of the balancing decisions the devs made in the ground mode does leave me scratching my head sometimes. Some vehicles like the Rebel rocket tank are just way too good at what it does. The individual unit AI is functional, but it's not the best. It works, but you might have to micro them to squeeze out the best possible performance. Sometimes the pathfinding gets fucked, sometimes it's targeting that gets fucked. From my experience, these only happen when there's way too much units taking up real estate or if units are positioned weirdly. So spacing them out and placing them properly could potentially solve this issue somewhat. For space battles, things are a little bit more complicated, but overall, still pretty easy to get into. What I said earlier about ground battles still very much apply here. Controls are very basic. Click or drag to select, right click to give orders, click on the ability button when you feel like it, all that jazz. This isn't like Homeworld where you have to consider the third dimension when giving orders. Space battles happen entirely on a two-dimensional plane, and while this does limit the kind of orders you can give drastically, I still think it's ultimately for the better to keep this part simple. That being said, there is one aspect that makes space battles require a little bit more involvement from the players, and that has to do with the ship tonnages. So you see, the way the game balances the different ship sizes is actually quite interesting. Bigger ships are significantly more powerful than smaller ones, but to balance this out, they have different modules scattered around the body. This might be guns, hangars, shield generators, or engine. These individual modules have their own separate health bars, and depleting the module's health bar destroys it. So if you want to disengage from an enemy fleet, but you're not confident in being able to outrun it, you can blast apart their engines, which slows them down tremendously. Or if you want to stop enemy ships from spawning new fighter squadrons constantly, you can target their hangars. This adds a lot more micro-intensity to the space battles that's simply not present in the ground battles. You can honestly tell that Petroglyph paid a lot more attention to the space battles during development. Space battles are easily the strongest aspect of Empire at War. So now you know how to command your fleets and armies in battle, but still you need to learn how to build them in the first place. Now this actually depends on which mode you're playing. In skirmish modes, you have a pre-built base where you have access to everything from unit recruitment to tech level research. The only semblance of base building you get in skirmish mode are these capturable build pads where you can construct support towers or economy buildings. That's it. It's a very simple and streamlined system that keeps your overall focus on fighting the enemy. You don't have to fuss about with the economy since you only have one resource type to deal with. No need to manage 3 different resource collection buildings. It's just the one type, which again keeps things simple and straightforward. This oversimplified and streamlined system has equal amounts of ups and downs. This is especially true in the ground mode skirmish battles since there's no real base building. This puts a drastically low ceiling in how you can play with a sandbox. You know those RTS game stories from other players where that one single builder unit managed to escape, allowing this one dude to rebuild their entire army and make a major comeback? Yeah, that's not happening in Empire at War. What you see is what you have, and what you can do with them are entirely limited by what the game provides. That sort of out-of-the-box playstyle is just non-existent for this game. However, that's for skirmish mode. For campaign mode, things get significantly more interesting. Now, there are two separate types of campaigns, which is the narrative campaign and the Galactic Conquest campaign. But honestly, Conquest easily steals the spotlight for the game. Galactic Conquest is what I believe gives Empire at War its replayability. When I first loaded up the Galactic Conquest mode as a kid, I was blown away. The campaigns in Empire at War aren't just another scripted series of levels like most contemporary RTS games, but is instead more akin to a beginner-friendly grand strategy game. I mean, sure, the scripted campaign follows a set narrative with its own pre-made missions, but it's still built around the framework of Galactic Conquest, which immediately sets it apart from its contemporaries. In the scripted campaign, you're given a lot of leeway in how you tangle with the preset missions, since you can build your own forces outside of the levels. These are pretty much alright. The Forces of Corruption campaign is pretty good, but overall I don't really see it as anything special. While the Star Wars license does lift up the material a bit, again, it kind of feels like just another RTS campaign. However, outside of the scripted campaign is where Empire at War really shines. When you play Galactic Conquest, the game breaks open the dam and lets you mess around with everything it has to offer. Without the constraints of round-based skirmishes and semi-linear scripted campaigns, the game's open-ended structures lets you tackle the problem of destroying your enemy however way you please. Empire at War makes a major leap from your run-of-the-mill RTS game to something really special. And this, I believe, is mostly due to the added grand strategy layer that is available in Galactic Conquest. You're not just building one army, but an entire faction's worth, across multiple star systems to take on another faction who has access to the same sandbox as you. Before you start a Galactic Conquest campaign, you first have to choose which galaxy map or scenario you want to play. This deals with how many planets you want in your campaign, what tech level you want to start in, so on and so forth. Already, Empire at War is providing a lot of options, which provides a lot of incentive to replay the game. Once you're in is where the fun begins. You first have to build up your faction. You do this by building up bases in the planets that your faction controls. This means building barracks, space stations, vehicle factories, resource collectors, and the like. Unit recruitment and resource collection is managed separately on each different planet as opposed to being faction-wide. So, for example, if you've only got one heavy vehicle factory in your entire faction built in Coruscant, if this is the case, you can only ever build heavy vehicles in Coruscant. If you somehow lose Coruscant to an enemy invasion, the heavy vehicle factory is gone and you're going to have to build a new one in your territory somewhere. The same principle applies to resource collection. If you've packed Tatooine to the brim with resource collectors, then your economy is going to get fucked if you lose the planet. But recruitment and resource collection aren't just the kinds of buildings you can build. There's also what I call support buildings, like shield generators or hypervelocity guns, which can give you a very real edge during battles. Shield generators are pretty self-explanatory. When you build one, when an enemy invades you, you have a massive shield dome which protects you from enemy attacks from the outside. So your enemy's going to have to cross into that shield dome in order to fight you. Hypervelocity guns are basically artillery from the surface. During space battles, you can leverage these hypervelocity guns to attack enemy ships from off the map. However, keep in mind that each planet has different amounts of building slots as well as different ownership buffs. For example, Kuat might only have 3 building slots, but all capital ships built here are discounted. On the other hand, Tatooine might get 6 building slots and a buff to resource collection. With that in mind, you might want to turn Tatooine into the linchpin of your economy while you turn Kuat into a naval stronghold. These are the kinds of things that you're going to have to carefully consider because this is going to heavily impact your entire faction's performance. Also, keep in mind that you can only ever have 10 ground units garrisoned on a planet's surface at all times. You can also only have 3 fleets orbiting a planet at any given time. Be careful with this. since ground units stationed in the orbit will show up as transport ships if they get caught in a space battle. Alright then, so you've properly set up your planets and built your fleets and armies. This means it's time to mobilize them. Getting to and from planets is going to require a hyperspace jump. Now this sounds simple, but there's actually a lot of thought to it. You see, there's two kinds of hyperjumps, one following a hyperlane and one that doesn't. Hyperlanes are these long lines that connect different planets and star systems to each other. They form a network connecting multiple planets together, and hyperjumps between connected star systems are very quick. So quick that it's kind of hard to react to an enemy attack through a hyperlane. On the other side of the spectrum is hyperjumps not following a hyperlane. These are kind of slow, but the plus side is you're not locked to the hyperlane network. You can jump to any planet that's within your fleet's hyperjump range, but remember that these jumps are slow. If the enemy is using a non-hyperlane jump to attack a planet of yours that is a part of the hyperlane network, it is actually possible for you to reinforce that planet with a fleet before the enemy even arrives. Keep all of this in mind since there's no way to stop a fleet once they've actually taken the jump to light speed. Now your fleets arrived in the enemy star system. Save for a few planetless star systems, you've got two battles ahead of you, the space battle and the ground battle. This should be fairly simple to understand. You need to take out the enemy in orbit before you can move in your ground force. Keep in mind that unlike skirmish battles, you can't build any extra units on the fly. What you've got on your fleet is what you have for the battle at hand. This is what Galactic Conquest is gonna be overall. It's a near infinitely replayable game mode that you can come back to over and over and over again, and it's almost guaranteed that no campaign is going to go the same way. The enemy AI is competent enough to really give you a run for your money, though it can be a bit stupid sometimes. It's a bit of a mixed bag, though given that it's a pretty old game, this shouldn't be too surprising. From my experience so far, Galactic Conquest AI is usually pretty competent, while the actual battle AI generally resorts to just sending their troops on a beeline to yours once you've been spotted. It's not the best, but it's pretty serviceable. Thankfully, if the AI isn't cutting it for you, you can always hook up a friend and go head-to-head against each other. That's right, this 16-year-old game has a fully functioning multiplayer suite when many of its contemporaries don't anymore. You see, like many games of its time, Empire at War originally relied on GameSpy for its multiplayer service. However, GameSpy eventually went the way of Alderaan and took out a bunch of other games down with it. Notable casualties include Battlefront 2 Classic, Republic Commando, Rise of Nations, and Neverwinter Nights. But not Empire at War. This was because Petroglyph actually managed to transition the game from GameSpy to Steamworks right around the time when the service shut down. So now Steam players can play multiplayer with all the bells and whistles that Steamworks integration entails. Both Skirmish and Galactic Conquest are completely playable with your Steam friends. It's all very easy to use too, being only a few clicks to get a lobby running for you to play with your friends. It's a hell of a lot of fun. Playing against a human opponent really shows off the game at its best. It's an amazing experience to make a dramatic comeback in a skirmish match against your buddy, or to see a several-hour-long Galactic Conquest session finally come to a climactic end. Empire at War truly is a complete package that offers a hell of a lot for what it's charging, and I would recommend the game solely based on the out-of-box experience alone, except that there's a lot more that the game is offering. A hell of a lot more. The 2014 update that Petroglyph rolled out didn't just save the game's multiplayer, but also introduced Steam Workshop integration. Empire at War always had a pretty active modding scene prior to this, but this update made getting mods so much more accessible than before. There's no need to navigate through ModDB's clunky user interface to download a mod and its 3 separate patches before having to manually install it yourself. Now it's about as complicated as clicking the subscribe button on the Mods Workshop page. The Star Wars franchise has always shined brightest when the community could do its own thing with it, and Empire at War is no exception to this. It is absolutely amazing what the community has been able to do with this game. From simple balancing mods to all-encompassing total conversion mods, there is so much content to chew on that it's unreal. It's absurd. I mean, it really is absurd how much variety there is. If you want a Clone Wars Total Conversion mod for Empire at War, there's like 3 on the Steam Workshop off the top of my head, each offering a different type of experience. Again, I can't say enough how amazing this is. The base game alone would have been enough for me to recommend Empire at War, but the modding scene goes above and beyond in making this game worth the price. So let's say everything I've said so far has convinced you to pick up the game. Where would you grab a copy? Well, Steam. It's the best option you have available. I mean, sure, the GOG version exists, but that version never got the multiplayer and modding update. If you don't buy the Steam version, you're stuck with the pre-Steamworks version of the game, which is still pretty good, don't get me wrong. You're pretty much getting the same out-of-box single-player experience from the GOG version, but after all the updates that the Steam version gets, I'm not quite sure if mods are still compatible with the pre-Steamworks version. If they are, that's great, but you're still getting no multiplayer. So if you're going to pick up the game, don't hobble your own experience. Grab the Steam version. Trust me, it's a good pickup even if you're not into Star Wars or RTS games. Solid recommend. And that just about wraps up this video. Hit that like button if you feel like it, and if you want more reviews from me, hit that subscribe button too. This has been Cheems of Regret, wishing you all good luck and Godspeed. Signing out.